This picture is going to have quite a complicated background to it, but it's still important that it doesn't detract from the main focal point, which is the tiger itself. First, to create a sense of depth in the background, we want to give this area an out of focus, blurry appearance. Now there are a few ways that this can be done, but the way that I favour is to use some graphite powder and apply this with a makeup brush, and this produces a good base to start with. To help with the application of the powder, I use a piece of scrap paper, and this is folded over on the edge to create a trough. The reason for this will become apparent in a second. The first thing is to dip the brush in the powder. This can then be used on the scrap paper and the excess will fall into the trough where it can be reused. Now graphite can tend to vary from one manufacturer to another, so personally I prefer to make the powder myself. Graphite products not only consist of graphite, but they also contain a binder as well. And this can be made up from either a clay or a wax or a combination of the two. And incidentally, because I use Caran d'Ache pencils, the powder that I'm using was made from a 3B Caran d'Ache block. Like I said, you can apply the graphite to the surface of the paper using a number of different tools, purely depending on the type of effect that you want to create. But for the out of focus background that I want for this picture, I personally find that the makeup brush works the best. So now I'm happy with how this area is starting to look, I can start to darken the tone further. This is a relatively simple but nevertheless time-consuming process, as it just simply involves adding more layers of graphite. And as you can see, I'm just applying this by dabbing the brush on the surface. Now you may be wondering, why work on the background first and not the tiger? And there's a very simple answer to this question. Well, by having a degree of the dark background in first, I then find it's much simpler to then gauge the correct level of contrast when it comes to working on the main subject. So I'm using a couple of brushes to do this. This one is quite thick and soft, and this is ideal for these real subtle transitions here. But for an area like this, it requires a bit more control, so for this I have to use a slightly finer brush. This is again the same process as using the other brush, applying layers of graphite to build shape and tone. It's just a question of how many layers are needed to achieve the desired effect. This does take a little bit of time to achieve the depth of tone that I want, but I am quite pleased with how the picture has developed so far. There is some finer work to do as well, so for this I've switched to using a blending stump. Now the one that I'm using is fairly old and as such quite saturated with graphite, so I don't need to add any extra to it. But if I needed to, just as with the brush, I could always do this with some graphite powder. This is an ideal tool to use when it comes to working on the more intricate and detailed areas of the background, as although it produces a finer line, this still has a very soft appearance to it. So I just want to darken some of the areas a bit further, and to do this I'm going to have to use a 4B pencil now. So what I'm going to do is just apply the pencil very lightly over the surface, and then I can just use the thicker of the two brushes to blend this out. If you're going to try this, I'd recommend using a blunt pencil, as this way it avoids scratching the surface. Also apply the tone using a tight circular motion with a minimal amount of pressure. This way the graphite is just applied to the surface, making it much easier to blend. And if you do need to darken further, just simply repeat the process. It's also worth remembering that pencils do tend to vary from one manufacturer to the other, so it's worth experimenting with different grades to see which ones work the best for the brand that you are using. For any adjustments, a kneadable eraser can be used, and then the edges just blended out. Using the makeup brushes, tone is also applied to the very lightest areas of the background. This has the effect of reducing the level of contrast, as I don't want this to detract from the main subject. It is inevitable that after working on the background, some tone will accidentally get brushed into the whiskers, so they just need a bit of a clean-up. I start by cleaning out the whiskers using an electric eraser. Now this one comes with two tip sizes, and because this is quite delicate work, I'm using the finer of the two for this. The edges can then be delicately tidied up, and for this I'm using a sharp F pencil. This will maintain a sharp point and will also manipulate the darker tone surrounding the whisker to give a very clean edge. At some point I will have to add some shading and shadow to the whiskers, but that'll be much later on when the picture nears completion. But at least for now they're all cleaned out. The only other thing that I want to do is to just carry the picture up to the border. So to do this I just need to mask off the edge. I'd always recommend using a low tack tape for this, as you don't want anything that's going to adhere to the paper too aggressively. This also only needs to be very lightly attached. The border was initially indented into the paper using a 4H pencil, as this gives a nice sharp edge to work up to. Once the background's been applied, the tape can then carefully be removed. There isn't really anything too technical with this, so don't be afraid to give it a try. Thanks for watching, and if you do have any questions, just leave them in the comments below.